Welcome to What Matters, a Black Lives Matter podcast. I'm your host, Ariel Robinson, and I'm joined by Dejanay Parker, Joshua Joseph, and Dr. Xavier Buck. We are members of the BLM community. On today's episode, we're diving into the critical topic of Black jobs and economics, a vital issue that deserves our attention. We'll start by reflecting on a key historical moment when our community flourished economically. To find solutions to the problems plaguing our community, we must reflect on our past. Lots of us are familiar with Tulsa, but have you ever heard of Bronzeville? Bronzeville was a vibrant neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Often called the Black Metropolis, Bronzeville became a culturally rich beacon of hope and opportunity during the Great Migration. At its peak, more than 300,000 people lived in the narrow 7-mile strip of land between 22nd and 63rd Streets. Two powerhouse institutions played crucial roles in fostering economic prosperity and shaping Bronzeville's identity: the Chicago Defender newspaper and the Supreme Life Insurance Company. The Chicago Defender, founded by Robert S. Abbott in 1905, actively encouraged Southern families to move north. Famously publishing train schedules and job listings, it became known as America's Black newspaper, promoting Chicago as a promised land. Meanwhile, the Supreme Life Insurance Company, founded in 1919, became a cornerstone of Bronzeville's economic success. In an era when many white-owned companies refused to serve our community, Supreme Life offered financial security and dignity. Under the leadership of John H. Johnson, who later founded the iconic Ebony and Jet magazines, the company grew exponentially, reinvesting in the community and helping build Bronzeville's thriving middle class. By the 1950s, Supreme Life had over $40 million in assets and branches in 12 states, exemplifying Black entrepreneurship and economic empowerment. Despite the thriving Black communities we once had, our path to generational wealth was disrupted. Today, the stats are stark. The median white household boasts a net worth 10 times greater than that of the median Black household. In fact, the wealth of the 400 richest American billionaires exceeds that of all 10 million Black American households combined. To illustrate, while the median white family had approximately $184,000 in wealth in 2019, the median Black family had just $23,000. Join us as we explore these disparities and discuss ways to reclaim and build economic power within our community.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to What Matters. I'm Dejanay Parker.
I'm Dr. Xavier Buck.
And I'm Joshua Joseph.
And today we want to talk about Black jobs and the economy.
Yeah.
Black jobs.
What is a Black job?
Here we go.
Yeah. How have you seen the economy under Biden's administration?
Ooh. I feel like there's a lot of crossover because I feel like no one actually pays attention to what the economy was like under any given president until it's the next president, and they're like, "Well, your economy was bad." But I think for me, it's been really weird. I think my job is unusual, so I do content creation and social media stuff. So the problems that I see with that aren't necessarily indicative of any administration. I think for content creators, there's a problem where there's not a value attached to their work. So the rates for what you'll get paid are all over the place. People have a similar size as me and get a deal for $100 and be like, "Oh, I'm grateful," and then other people will be like, "Nah, you gotta, time is money." So there's really no industry standard, but that's just as a social media has become super prominent recently, so people are still trying to figure it out. For a more established sense, I know my mom is a nurse, so she was on the front lines during COVID and everything. And as a product of there being a nurse shortage, she was able to make a lot more money than she ever got to make before during the middle of the pandemic. After that, it's kind of returned back to normal stuff. There hasn't been as much support in that regard, but I'd be lying if I told you that I know exactly what policy made it that way, or if it's just a general lack of value when it comes to healthcare workers, especially Black women in healthcare. So, but I think that's been my personal view on the economic situation. It's been something that I don't have time as much to think about as much, but for a lot of people, it's every day, what's going on, how am I going to get XYZ, what is the stance when it comes to my job and how they look at me in the economy. So I think it's a very interesting thing to cover personally, but I know a lot more about broad scopes when it comes to at least Biden in particular.
Man, well, let me tell you, it's hard out here.
Yeah, boy.
It's hard.
It's expensive. Rent is high. Groceries are high. Gas is high. My kids seem even more expensive every day.
When eggs were $15 eggs, there was a time when eggs were
Come on.
over $11 for a carton of eggs.
Come on.
my
Come on.
How are we supposed to eat? How's the average person supposed to eat?
Wow.
Come on. But, I don't know if I necessarily blame Biden for the economy right now. You know, every president inherits the previous president's economy.
Yep.
And we just came out of a pandemic.
Yeah.
Like a whole pandemic where everything shut down and we had remote work. It was just such a strange time.
Yeah.
And we're just out of that. So it's hard to even assess like where we are right now. I just know it's rough. And I don't think some cash payments like Trump gave out would help it at all.
Oh my gosh.
I also am more so looking at the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates more than whatever Biden and Kamala are talking about. Unless he actually going to forgive my student loans.
I know for me that when I think about presidential elections, I've always thought about the economy. And this is before I was even old enough to vote. And that's because when Bush was in office, I remember before Bush was in office, life seemed great for me. Well, I never heard, no, you can't have that, or never heard my mom like, oh, I'm struggling to pay a bill, or things like that. Like, I never even thought about it. But I remember how it shifted so much when Bush was in office. And people might say like 9/11 happened and stuff, right? But it's still something about that always stayed in my head about the term of the president and how the economy shifts. As soon as Bush got in office, I always remember it felt like struggle.
That's that Great Recession.
It felt like struggle. We couldn't keep a car. We couldn't, we had our home, but it was just like I could see my mom struggling. And so I always just inherited that whoever the president is in office is going to shape what my life looks like for the next 4 years. You mentioned you don't know what laws and bills, right? Which is true. We don't actually see those things, but we do see gas prices go up.
Yeah.
We do see groceries go up, or we see like, hey, I'm smooth selling. And so I think about with the Biden administration, while yes, there was a pandemic, and that may be what they equated to. Well, there's a pandemic, but when there was a pandemic, Black people, is because we're always in a state of surviving. Right. So that didn't harm us because we already been having our side hustles and being able to just make it how we can out of the mud. But we were not in the state of where we are now where we can't afford eggs.
But I think also that's like, I think in a spiritual sense it didn't affect us, but also like the main demographic of people who were affected were Black people, specifically because we're like frontline workers. Black and brown people disproportionately make up a lot of like gig economy jobs. So when it came to people suffering and dying from COVID, we bared the brunt of that. And it's like, yeah, we could afford a lot more stuff because we went from like generally prosperous times to like a once in 100-year pandemic, but also like everything fell off. Like when it came to people weren't driving, so like gas prices were like $1 and $1.50, $2 because
where you live?
Huh? Oh, in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
During the pandemic. I'm talking about in the middle of the
Oh,
pandemic.
still, the gas prices was $1. I haven't seen dollar gas prices since I was 2.
It approached because there was
I remember when gas prices
You don't
used
remember
to
that
be.
too?
It was
Somebody told
approaching
me
like that because like I remember there was like OPEC and the different like areas that control oil were like paying like for people to take the oil off their hands because it wasn't being utilized because no one was driving for gas production. So that drives prices for like everything down. So I feel like we're on like a worldwide that happened across the world. So when it comes, when we're now in an economy where it's like, okay, everyone's outside again, everyone's buying stuff again, it's going to drive up the price. But also, besides just people buying stuff again, a lot of these companies thinking that they can get away with price gouging stuff that cost way less before the pandemic. So it's like a lack of oversight in making sure that they can't do that, which is why I'm happy. I forget who, but I know there are a couple people who are like trying to target that price gouging now. And then also just like acknowledging that, yeah, it is kind of like a worldwide thing, which is why I know that like a lot of things cost a lot less prior, but it also is like you have to kind of take into consideration that it was a once in 100-year like thing. So I feel like our struggles now are a product of like things getting back to like normal economic standards where Black people as a whole are like very much struggling. It was just like when everything stopped costing as much, we had some sort of disposable income for the first time in a minute.
But you know what's different is right now it's not just Black people struggling. That's usually the norm.
Yeah.
that black people were thriving during COVID. Everybody else was struggling. We still was figuring it out the same way we've been figuring out. And now we're in an economy where, as you said, it's hard for everybody. There's a reason why Trump talks about, there's a reason why Kamala's main point is she's going to lower groceries, which is so minimal. If that has to be your plan, there's a reason why she's talking about that. And there's a reason why, on the other hand, Trump is saying, well, I did more for black people than any other president. Because the levels of struggle that we're in based on when they're in office. Now, that's not to say that he did more. It's a soundbite that he can use because he knows right now people are struggling. And so he can take that and say, well, when I was in office, you weren't. So
but you know,
I'm curious to hear what you'd say.
It just seems like the president's so removed. Like where I live in West Oakland, we don't have a grocery store. You know what I mean? We have to go across town, and even the closest grocery stores have all the old food. It's another thing, Safeway, even back in the day in the 60s and 70s, they would take the food from the wealthier neighborhoods, and when it was about to expire, they would put it into the black neighborhoods. They still do that. The Safeway, the Target. Now we have a black-owned co-op that's near me, but they always run out of food because of how much the need is. So I'm like, people talking about grocery prices, we just trying to get groceries, period. Right? And it's like, you know, we spend so much time on tension thinking about the president, and they're not going to have much control over these grocery prices like that. They'll have something. I'm more concerned with how many community gardens can we build? How many kind of cooperative styles can we have to make sure we have healthy food and a free food available to our communities, especially in like hyper-local senses. You know, it's like, who cares about all these politics if we're not taking care of ourselves?
Can you speak to inflation? How inflation works?
In what way?
How inflation affects the black community?
I mean, it affects everybody. I mean, when the interest rates goes up and everything gets more expensive, I mean, it's hard to get loans. It's hard. Your credit card payments are much higher if you're not paying them off right away, right? Anything that has interest accrues. Also, but if you have money saved up in an account, the interest rates are higher, so you can gain more money. So the problem with the racial wealth divide is that usually white folks have the savings and the black folk don't. So we end up paying more and the white folks end up earning more. I think the pandemic did affect everybody. Like you said, like especially with frontline workers, black people are the people that were hurt the most. But whether it was the Great Recession, it was the pandemic, it affected Americans nationwide. It just sucks that the way that class works in this country, black people are always built right into that.
It's kind of contextualized because I feel like the maliciousness in a person like Trump being able to use the talking point that it's like because people are struggling now that like, well, you weren't struggling as much prior to the during the pandemic. It's like, well, that's also indicative of the policies of people who were in power leading up to that pandemic, which was people like Trump, which like we look at who you took care of under your time. You took care of the billionaires. You took care of the rich people. They got the tax cut. They got the tax breaks. They got, if no matter what happened with this economy, y'all gonna be straight. We didn't get none of that. So it's like we were doing better with the stuff that we already had, and then we were left out in the dust the moment that everything started ramping back up after COVID. So it's like the reason why you can point out like, oh, you're struggling now or whatever, it's because y'all didn't do nothing to make sure we weren't gonna struggle when this exact scenario happened. And you're the one who's predisposed to the information to know like, okay, this pandemic is happening, all economy is gonna like freeze. Then when the economy comes back, those lowest people are gonna be hurt immediately. Was that enough on their radar for them to say, oh, I care, let me do something about it? Absolutely not, because it almost never is. So it's like, it's kind of like that political football where it's like, all right, cool, y'all struggling now because of them. Well, no, you're struggling now because of them, where it's like all of y'all could have done something at this point to ensure that we were straight, and no one did because that's not like the priority. So that's just kind of my like perspective on that, because I feel like he does get a lot of like credence, especially within the black community, when they say stuff like, oh, he did the loan, he did the PPP, he did the stimulus checks, but it's like I seen someone run the numbers on the stimulus checks. That's 75 cents a day at this point. Like that's what we giving props for when there could have been so much more, and people were fighting to increase those payments that weren't Donald Trump. So it's like there's so much that leads into it, but I feel like there's also so much that leads into it that we don't really get like the full context. Where I mean, I can't blame nobody for being like, hey, it wasn't as hard then, it's hard now.
I'm wary of any economic policy that isn't about black people becoming independent. Like we always talking about jobs. Why aren't we talking about us building our own businesses and hiring our own? Like we never had, because when we talk about jobs, we're often talking about like low wage jobs, right? Ways for us to continue struggling. And so it's like, if you're going to be giving investments overseas, I want the same benefits that a lot of white people have gotten, which is you're starting to get contracts overseas, right? You're starting to connect your business to economies all across the world. Do I like this colonial framework? No. But if I can't stop them from giving all this money all over the world, I at least want black people to benefit and for us to be economically independent.
Right. So then you're talking about going into being able to get loans, right? From banks and stuff, which is extremely hard.
Or contracts, more than anything.
Yeah.
You know?
But you have to have those relationships and you have to have those means. And because the generational wealth gap is so extreme, how do we then be able to say, okay, we don't want to, like, I get what you're saying, which is a self-determination. We want to build it on our own. We don't need you.
I think there's a lot of stuff that ties into the creation of the racial wealth gap. I mean, obviously, when it comes to, you had an entire demographic of people start off with nothing and be able to be froze out of the economy in every sense. So it's like any money and I feel like that's kind of what I was going to touch on before we started talking, was that like, the increase in like capitalism doing what capitalism is doing and black people not really having a share in the development of the American economy over time means that like any money that we're putting back into the American economy is not coming back around to the black community. There aren't as many like prevalent instances of black owned businesses that are in black owned like neighborhoods predominantly that can help fund and do different things like Tulsa, like when that was like prominent. And we don't see that as much anymore because there are so many different avenues that are taking your money now, when there are so many different companies. There's a Walmart, there's a McDonald's, there's a Burger King, there's all these predominantly white-owned, multi-billion-dollar international corporations that, like, if you give the average black person any money, the moment they decide to spend that money somewhere, it's going to go to a pocket that's not going to come back to the black community. So trying to break down that and encouraging, like, it's one thing that it trips me up so much because I would love to be a big proponent of like black people owning our own businesses, reinvesting into community, but that's like assuming that not only do we have an equal chance to even begin those businesses, that even if you are to begin those businesses, they have a fat chance of even succeeding, because that's how capitalism in this country is designed, is that once the same banks that are supposed to be giving us these loans are the same banks that have existed since 1841 that have just been acquired and merged into different names or whatever. So it's like no one's starting new banks that is like becoming a competitor with all these big ass companies, even though they promise you that like, oh, you keep buying into this investment model, you're gonna start your business, it's gonna get to the level, and then you could be the next Walmart. That's not how it is in practice, because then that Walmart buys you out and lowers stuff on the market. So that's one of my biggest things about how do we get to that point where like so much of that racial wealth gap is included in the fact that it's like very hard to impossible to spend money and have that circulate within the black community, just because they've eroded a lot of those structures. So I'm curious to your perspective on that historically, like if we could get to or if you could see a steps we could take to get to that future.
Man, first of all, I feel you. One, I don't think we'll ever be free from the economic system that slavery built.
Yeah.
Right. Like what you said about our modern insurance system, the way our New York Stock Exchange was set up, the way all of our economic system in this country was built off of us. So it's hard for me to imagine any real freedom under this system. But we also talk about like real change, right? Like what could happen tomorrow? What could happen tomorrow to actually change this racial wealth gap is reparations. Y'all know I've been wanting to talk about it.
Skip right to it.
I'm saying, well, yeah, you gotta get right to it, right? It's just like, what are we even talking about? Like, you could have all these diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. You could have more integrated neighborhoods. You can have even some contracts go to usually a black middle class that would benefit from it, just like black middle class benefited from affirmative action. You can have all these kind of reformist policies, but we're not talking about flipping the thing on its head until we're really talking about reparations. You can't.
Before we get to reparations, I have a thought. So because you're hitting on this earlier, Xavier, I think. Going back, you said you want us to, and why are we like looking for a job, right? When we can build our own jobs. And you're saying how do we have successful black businesses, right? One thing that I've noticed is they talk about the black dollar and how it circulates, right? There's a reason why the Hispanic dollar for instance, in COVID, the white dollar can circulate so many days, right? The Latino dollar can circulate so many days, and they say the black dollar will only circulate one day. if we had to rely on each other. And that's because we don't have connections to the continent. We don't have connections to the diaspora to be able to say, hey, the economy has shut down. I need you, and if somebody in Jamaica, to send me mangoes, and I'm going to send you toiletry. So that way now we have a system, and I'm going to sell the mangoes here to my community, and we're still feeding each other while you all have, every other community has that. They have a source back home to where they can go back home and get the resources that they need and bring to their community wherever they're at. And that's why the dollar circulates so long in other communities. And then obviously Western community runs the world. So white people have all the wealth, so they can go all over the place and spend their money. But we have to essentially
I think we give white people too much credit though, because it's like they're the dominant society. They're mainstream America. So it's like when we talk about circulating, we're talking about when they go to Walmart, did their dollar just circulate in their community?
Well, they own Walmart.
And that's what I'm saying. But most white people have no class connection to the owners of Walmart.
But they don't need it,
but we
because
give
they have the
ourselves our pressure in
generational
the black
wealth.
community.
But they have the generational wealth, so they don't need to know the person at Walmart.
I'm more partial to that view, but I feel like it kind of strays into the realm of trying to solve an institutional problem with like a personal solution. And what I mean by that is I feel like the same way that like the other demographics can have like statistics about how like their dollar circulates. I don't think it's as much of those demographics have built as much a relationship, and black people haven't, with ourselves yet. I think it's more like the relationship between governments and regions are just like completely different. So not only is it that black people don't have the institutional like building within ourselves to do that, we're also like a demographic that has like had consistently and the most antagonistic relationship with the United States because of how that power dynamic was even built.
Right.
So it's kind of like it was built in and of itself to where it's like we are not going to have that like connection just because like we're gonna McDonald'ize your entire like community. Everywhere you're gonna turn, you're going to have to spend this money at this low income or like low budget restaurant and everything because we took the money from you, and we're gonna put like stuff that is built and designed for you right next to you? No, because we made sure you couldn't do that in the first place. So we're gonna come in and supplement that and whatever. And it's kind of at a point where it's like, I don't know if it's necessarily on us to build that connections ourselves, or if it's on us to pull the levers that made it so that there's always a McDonald's there, but there's never like a black-owned store there that can actually meaningfully reinvest. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but maybe that does look like some forms of reparations, which is what we were talking about. Because it's like I feel like it kind of puts too much onus, like in what you said about giving white people too much credit. I feel like it almost puts too much onus on ourselves as individuals and what we like buy and do on a daily basis when we don't have the connections. But I think like a lot of other demographics, they might, but they also like struggle in all types of other senses that black people don't. So it's like a give and take with everything.
But if we're talking about self-determination, which is what we're talking about, then it is our responsibility to build those connections. On one hand, right, it's our responsibility. If we're saying that that's how we're going to be self-determined, we can't just like out of the middle of nowhere start a business and expect for it to be successful, especially if we have to go get our distribution from somebody who's charging us 2 times the price. And then that's why it's hard for black businesses to survive, because they're buying at a high price, and then they still have to try and make their money. Whereas other cultures are able to buy in bulk at a low price because they have those relationships across the board. Whereas usually within our community, we see a problem and we're trying to find a solution for that problem, but we're still already so deeply oppressed and trying to just fix a problem that it's hard to then sell those mangoes for 50 cents when you had to buy them from a Whole Foods store that's probably, a store that sells them in bulk, that's ran by a different culture than you, and they're selling it to you at a high price. So
I hear what y'all saying, but I still think we give white people too much credit. I don't think we give ourselves enough grace. And that's not an excuse. I think we have to keep the hustle going. We have to figure this thing out. But I think about, like, when you talk about our relationship to the government, I mean, everybody likes to talk about the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program, right? They woke up every single morning, these scrappy group of teenagers, and fed these kids before they went to school so they wouldn't be hungry and they could actually learn something. Now, we don't have free breakfast in America because the federal government across America now, because the federal government loved that program.
Right.
We have free breakfast across America now, including like the free lunch program in 10 Walt states in Minnesota that everybody's talking about, because the government wanted to weaken the Black Panther Party. They wanted to weaken our ability to depend on ourselves. And so by making sure that the government fed the kids instead of the Black Panther Party feeding the kids, all of a sudden now that breaks up that moment of self-determination. It breaks up everything we were building. And so every single time, whether it was Black Wall Street, all the way to the Black Panther Party, to efforts today, it seems like the government steps in and makes sure that we're doubling down on our tax dollars and paying into a system that doesn't work for us and then doesn't help us either. You know, and it's just like, I say we need grace for that, but it doesn't mean we stop hustling. It's not an excuse, but it's been rough out here.
No, yeah, I agree with you. And I think I would say if we keep being self-determined and we keep finding ways to provide what the government is not providing for, we force the government to give us what we need, because now we don't have to fight for free food, free breakfast, right? It's a staple thing. People don't think about it. Or even urgent care, right? That's also a thing that came from the Black Panther Party. And people think, oh, urgent care is normal, but it's because they were so self-determined that they found ways to connect with each other and build a system that forced the government to step in and say, oh, well, we want to provide this because we want to weaken you, but it really helped us. And it really made us stronger.
That's kind of like my mentality about those situations, is that I see the approach to self-determination as something like that. Like, regardless of whether or not the government had stepped in to provide this program because they realized that the Black Panther Party is going to get very popular if they keep doing it, we don't keep doing it. I see that as like progress, in the sense that, like, yeah, now we live today in an age where it's like we still don't have that self-determination, but maybe that's just another way to get that self-determination, in the sense that, like, if we can force enough things to happen where you're going to start taking care of your citizens, and specifically your Black citizens, more, then that is like you get to an area where you can have more Black kids being born in better school districts that give them a higher likelihood of having upwards mobility and starting that business that they can then do XYZ.
But I'm gonna tell you, when the government does it instead of us, it looks different. When if I'm on Medi-Cal or Medicaid and I take my kids to the doctor, they're gonna ask me, do I own a home? Do I rent? What's my income? What's my job? Just to get a physical for my kids. You know what I mean? Yeah. They're gonna ask me, is there violence happening in the home? They're gonna ask me about, have you been homeless? All kind of just invasive questions they're gonna ask. They ask about the relationship between the parents, all that, just to get a checkup, right? When the Panthers set up their medical clinics, you just walked in. You knew what days. It could be like a Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. You knew a doctor was gonna be there. You go in, get checked in, and they could do a referral out if you really needed some care from like a major hospital. But it's like, when the government does it, it doesn't have the same love that we have for each other in our community.
Yeah, I love that, because I feel like it would be more homely, more like of an experience or whatever, to have it on that local level where like everyone in the community is working towards this certain thing and you can have those availability. Do you see like a way in which like that investment can happen, so that you kind of reinvest into those Black communities and make it so that, like, even if there's a national program that's like, okay, we have universal health care, even in those Black communities, it'll still be like a Black-centric, like comfortable, like stuff, kind of like the Panthers.
I want to hear a president that says, I'm going to offer some big-time contracts to Black organized, Black nonprofits and cities across America to do the work themselves. Just give us the money and let us do what we've been doing.
You brought up reparations, and I love the topic of reparations because I feel like as it obviously has to look different for the Black community because of our inherent struggle. You can't just give us all money and then it creates our problems to go away. We saw that with PPP loans, right? It didn't take away our problems, probably made them worse. So reparations is a sticky conversation. For me, I think we could have reparations in so many ways. We need better schools. We need homes. We need we need good grocery stores in our community. We need healthcare that supports us. We need doctors who listen to us. We need people who look like us in these places. And so what if reparations look like giving the government putting in, as communities, or putting in infrastructure for care in the Black community that allows us to be able to not just only see oppression, and to have resources that actually allow us to learn more about STEM, so that we then can start our own business and start a tech center or be able to run these things, because we don't have those resources in our community to even learn. I used to write on a typewriter. I used to literally have to write my paperwork on a typewriter because we didn't have a computer. Like, and there's still so many people in our community who are lacking technology because they cannot afford it. And so it's like, and then that just puts you so far below. So when I think of reparations, I think of those things. Like, what does our community need to be just on the same playing field as everyone else? As a starting space. Like, they always, they have that game where it's like, step 1 foot forward if you grew up in a 2-parent household, step 1 foot forward. Yeah. So we could take all those steps and see how far Black people are from the average person who has these different things. If we use reparations to even take care of some of those things, we could find ourselves being put on a even playing field, opposed to just giving each individual a check, and then we're putting that money right back into the same system that's been oppressing us for all these years. That's my take on reparations.
Yeah, I mean, I think a number of things. First of all, when people say reparations, I ask, well, what are we repairing from? Because, of course, slavery is just the first thing we think of, but we could be talking about slavery. We could be talking about the decades of political and personal violence we call lynching. Mm-hmm. We could be talking about redlining. We could be talking about the war on drugs, right? We could be talking about mass incarceration, right? And so it's like, to me, we need a series of reparations for all the wrongs that have been done. If we're talking about back in slavery, and let me put it this way, I think we need an infrastructure. I think we can get individual cash payments. I think also our nonprofits and institutions should get paid as well. But like when slavery ended, the federal government set up a freedmen's bank. That was supposed to be a safe place for former slaves to park their money and hope that it would grow. And it literally was made to make us economically independent. That was the purpose of a government-funded institution called the Freedmen's Bank. But they put a bunch of mediocre white people in charge of it who mismanaged the money, started speculating in railroads and land going west, and they lost all the money in the Panic of 1887, I believe. And so it's like, well, what is our bank? Let's just start there when we talk about infrastructure. If we're getting tons of money, where are we parking it? Let's start there, right? We could start with the Black-owned banks and how we can have them connect with each other, create a whole consortium of some sort, or we can have a government-funded institution specifically for folks to get reparations payments. And also, when you went to this bank, you also got financial literacy. You got a lot of stuff that came with it. So when I think about that, it's like, you know, I've talked about those contracts the government could offer so that we could, you know, build up our own community. I've talked about how do we expand our own businesses and local economies to stuff abroad. I've talked about having a central bank. These are all part of an infrastructure that's needed for reparations to happen. I just think we don't talk about it enough because we're so scared that if we don't have all this set up before we get the payments, we lost. Yeah. But I don't think there's any way that Black America is going to really come together if there's not individual payments.
We've talked about all of the things that are wrong, and we've talked about reparations. One of the things I'm really interested and curious on is repairing the Black family. Do we think that the Black family needs to be repaired? Do we think that a strong Black family unit helps with generational wealth? What do we think is a strong Black family unit?
I think that the premise of the Black family needing to be repaired assumes that, like, we're trying to go back to something. Like, there's statistics that people can pull about how, like, Black people's income or anything during this period of time was better than it is now in many ways, or worse than it is now in many ways. But Black people have always had to deal with the underlying trauma and hurt and despair and discrimination and racism or whatever that has come with the product of how we were issued into the system. So I think that, like, it's not even necessarily so much as repairing as like building a new model for moving forward. I don't believe there's any concrete way or concrete one way that the Black family can be strong, but I do know that there are certain ways in which, like, we have to deprogram ourselves from certain things. I think that with general policy, being able to allow, like, Black people, men and women and everyone, like, to make more money, that's gonna help. But also, like, just how we conceptualize, like, what a Black man is, what a Black woman is, what being Black and LGBTQ is. Like, having a different mindset towards all of that in general, I feel like in a self-empowerment point gives people the ability to chart that destiny for themselves, because it's a lot harder to worry about, like, your demographic as a people and how our family's gonna be fixed if you don't even feel like a part of your family because of who you date or whatever. So I feel like I think that generally education, but there's a lot of, like, unpacking we need to do with our own unconscious biases towards our own members of our own demographics in order to get that family structure. And I think that there's governmental policy that can also underpin that. That's like yeah, you have to be able to put kids in a better situation when they go to school. You have to be able to get rid of a lot of these social welfare programs that have clauses in them that like disincentivize two-parent households, because statistically, whether or not it's a gay couple or it's a straight heterosexual couple, two parents in the household regardless is going to have a much better impact on your kids and their ability to move upward in the economy. So I think, yeah, two-parent households, but also making sure that we can incentivize it. Like, there's not one way to concretely build that. You can also do that. You could also, it takes a village, right? You could also have that community aspect, and incentivizing that will mean you can break down stuff like making sure that there's more parks and making sure there's more communal areas in communities to make sure that that's a possibility. But there's so many things that we have to break down, I believe, with our own mentality towards how Black families look and like gender roles and stuff or whatever, that can also be followed with policy. But I think that is a very big mentality, because I feel like we don't even talk about that enough.
Yeah, your question made me think about my family. When the matriarch of our family passed away, and her house was sold, we sold grandma's house. All them people that were living in there for free had to find somewhere to go. So what that meant was the entire family broke up. A lot of people became homeless or on their own, dispersed. And the family was gone. And it wasn't until about 10 years later now that we're finally having kids, and all of a sudden it's organically coming together because we need each other, right? And so I say that as kind of a microcosm of the bigger issue. Like, when I think about the war on drugs and the way crack cocaine tore up our families, made us not trust one another, and made us blame people for being crackheads, even though, it's
Addiction.
It's addiction, but it's also, I mean, if you talk to people like here in LA, like, there was so much crack on the streets and it was so cheap that I know elders who had to sweep it up in the mornings before the kids came out on Sundays before they went to church. It was just laying out, right? $5 for a hit, right? And so it's just like, it wasn't our fault. And so I think organically, if we're put in environments where we can thrive in healthy environments, I think we will naturally come back together. But it's going to take some time. I think it is necessary. I think clearly everybody wants a family together, whether that's the family like when you marry somebody, you have kids, or it's the family that you make in your community. Like, it is necessary. The more we know each other, the easier it is to collaborate, the easier it is to work together, the easier it is to get money together, or the easier it is to politically organize together. What we saw when Black folks in the Great Migration moved to all these cities, a lot of them been living in these rural areas. Some people live next to each other and a lot of people didn't, but they were still able to organize across vast rural distances. Then they come to these cities where they're all on top of each other. They organized fast, right? And so I don't think we give Black people enough credit for what they did after the Great Migration in these cities. I mean, there's parts of LA that when white people lived there, didn't have sidewalks, didn't have streetlights, had nothing. And when Black people came there, they were able to organize so fast. All that stuff came within a year as soon as they got there, right? And so there was a kind of fabric to the community and to the family. Yes, we need that again. It's going to take just as much time to repair it as it took to destroy us.
And I think it also speaks to, like, the family's only going to be as good as the house that they're living in. Like, I feel like if you can have a two-parent household, white picket fence, all the stuff, but if it's lead in the paint in the walls, then you can only take that so far. So it does really come to, like, changing the environment that people are living in. And that goes right back to reparations and all the policies that you need to do, because I feel like you have to start people in an environment. You have to, for once in our history, get to a point where Black people can exist in a non-antagonistic framework for us to really get to measure what a future Black family gets to look like, because we have not had that yet. I get so sick when people like dog on the Black community about how, and especially like conservatives will talk about all these problems. You have not given these people to exist peacefully yet. You have not given them the chance to do that yet. So I feel like you give people that chance, you'll surprise how far they'll take it.
So we talked about a lot of problems. I want to hear the solutions. What's one big takeaway from this conversation that you all have? What's one solution that you could think of with your takeaway that can push the needle forward for our community?
I don't know if you were going to say it already, but reparations. And my thing is, it doesn't have to be like, okay, we got to do this big, sweeping, broad policy change in the United States tomorrow. But there's no excuse for not at least researching the very ways in which a reparations policy could be implemented. Because I don't believe that reparations is just going to be money, or it's just going to be community investment, or it's just going to be education, or it's just going to be anything. It goes all the way to the personal level. When it comes to the Black family and thinking about what's a future way in which we can build that, what are some policies that disincentivize the creation and the stability of the Black family that we can get away with, that we can get away of. I used the analogy earlier about like the lead paint in the walls. There are still Black communities with lead paint in the walls. That is inexcusable. I feel like there's the overall takeaway that I'd put is just there needs to be a concerted effort to build these environments to see how the Black community can thrive economically and in the family and everything when finally given the ability to do so without being antagonized. That's my thing.
You know, considering the kind of conditions we've lived under, I think that Black folk have always been so innovative and creative. Mm-hmm. And so I'm actually kind of encouraged by the prospects of new technology today, stuff like AI. It's the most decentralized technology has ever been. Mm-hmm. And I mean, we're talking about all these things that we can do in the Black community. We can input into a chat bar and say, hey, these are the problems we face. This is what we're trying to do. Create a plan for me. Help me connect with folks over in Jamaica and Brazil and in England, right? We can kind of create this economy with AI. It can be a helpful tool.
Don't say that too loud. Don't give away the
you don't give away the game.
Sure, no,
I'm giving away the game because the white people are already doing it, okay?
Yeah.
We still playing catch up.
Yeah.
So I'm saying AI could be a scary technology, but I'm really encouraged by what we can do with it because they have no control over what we do with it. Mm-hmm. Right? That's powerful.
Yeah, it's a powerful statement. For me, my biggest takeaway is that we need to have these conversations, that we need to do more research as a community as to why our lives are the way they are. Because there's reasons why everything is the way it is. And so to start looking into why are things the way they are, to look at history, to know what it used to be, where we are now, and what we want. And also, biggest takeaway is that, I think we all said it, that the Black family unit is so important. And we need to dream big, and we need to imagine how we're going to build whatever that unit looks like. For each individual can be different, but to understand that it is important to have a 2-parent household. It's important to not sell your grandma's house. Mm-hmm. To understand why these things are so important into the fabric of what it means to be Black in this world. Mm-hmm. Thank you all for tuning in to our podcast, What Matters.
As we wrap up today's episode, let's talk about a project that's focused on Black economic power. Oakland in the World Enterprises, founded by the one and only Elaine Brown. Back in 2015, Elaine set out on a big mission, creating businesses that were owned by the disenfranchised, especially the incarcerated. Oakland in the World is rooted in West Oakland, the place the Black Panther Party first made waves. Elaine, a former Panther leader, is bringing that revolutionary energy back, this time by creating jobs, affordable housing, and community-owned businesses through a complex called the Black Panther. She's building a market, a restaurant, a fitness center, and even a tech business. Black Lives Matter is all in. They've contributed $1 million to Oakland in the World, recognizing this as a blueprint for Black economic independence and real community power. Now we're calling on you, our listeners, policymakers, and everyone in the community to support this mission and others like it. Let's work together and make sure Black economic power isn't just a vision, but a reality.
Right.